I've been talking about the war nonstop for a month now. It's hard to believe that it's already been a month. And today, I'm not going to talk about the war so much. This is connected to the war, but I need to take a look back at the current state of the U.S. economy and where we're headed from here, because I'm afraid that the long run is here, and it's time to get sober. To borrow a line from the Keynes-Hayek rap battle, the taper has finished. Quantitative easing is no more, and no sooner is quantitative easing ending than quantitative tightening is set to begin. May, apparently, is supposed to be the first month of QT. It's hard to believe we're going that fast. We had QE through, I believe, through the end of March. And now we're starting QT in May. Now, the Fed is saying that QT is going to reach a rate of $95 billion a month, which is just, I mean, that's insane to think of. I mean, that's like around $1 trillion a year. I think it's more than $1 trillion a year. I should have done the math. Anyway, it's almost $1.2 trillion a year, right? I won't worry about it. The Fed's balance sheet is something like $7 trillion at this point, last I checked. It might be even higher. Maybe they're at $9 trillion now. I think they're at $7 trillion, though. So that's a pretty huge, in absolute terms and in percentage terms, that's a pretty big reduction in the balance sheet if the Fed were able to keep that up for a year. Now, keep in mind, in May, QT is not going to be $95 billion. I think what I read is that they're going to be stepping it up over the course of 3 months, and that QT is going to get to the point of being $95 billion. Now, who knows? The ramifications of this could be so disastrous that they call off QT before they even work their way up to $95 billion a month. But as it stands, the Fed seems, now these are not honest people we're dealing with, so take this with a nice fresh carton, unopened carton of Morton table salt. But they seem pretty hawkish. Not as hawkish as they should be, considering the rate of inflation. And if you were to calculate the rate of inflation in the old standard, the way that it was calculated when Paul Volcker was the Fed chairman, inflation is comparable at this point to the 1970s. And so, therefore, the Fed is extremely dovish when you consider that they are dealing with a similar situation to the one that Paul Volcker found himself in, yet they're talking about just $95 billion in QT a month at some point and potentially 50 basis point rate hikes. That's not anywhere close to raising interest rates up to 20%. I can't remember if mortgage rates hit that or if that was actually the Fed funds rate, but so forgive me, I might be off. Maybe Fed funds was 15 or something, and mortgage rates were 20 or 30 or something. No, they didn't get that high. They were in the 20s, I think, mortgage rates. But anyway, Volcker did that in like one shot. It was pretty much overnight. And the Fed funds rate wasn't at zero to begin with. The Fed funds rate in the late 70s, whatever it was, I can't remember exactly what it was. The Fed funds rate back then would cripple the United States. It would destroy America, let alone if we raised the Fed funds rate to where Paul Volcker raised it to. But if we just raised the Fed funds rate to where Paul Volcker started from, we would kill the U.S. economy. Beyond that, you would kill American society. People would be at each other's throats. There would be riots in the streets. But even though the Fed is not going to be that aggressive, what the Fed is embarking on is, by modern standards, extremely hawkish. It's much more aggressive than they were in the 2018 tightening cycle. Back then, they were hiking at 25 basis point increments, and they were doing that specifically because they wanted to do it on a granular level and watch closely after every rate hike, what was happening. But back then, we did not have the absurdly high levels of inflation that we're dealing with today. Believe it or not, back then I thought that stocks and housing were way overpriced, and they were. by historic standards. But gee, if I could have the opportunity to buy a house today for what they were going for back in 2018, oh, those were the days. And back then, where was it that the Fed got the Fed funds rate up to? Oh yeah, it was 2.25%. That's what killed the American economy back then. That was until the Fed flip-flopped, which I've gone over ad nauseum on this channel. In the interest of not boring long-term listeners, I will not get into that again. But 2.25% was half of what the Fed got to back in 2008 when they broke the economy. That was around 5%. And so this time, we would expect that in this extremely fragile Fed-funded super bubble that we're in now, somewhere half of 2.25% should be the breaking point for this economy. And then you have to throw in the massive amounts of QT. Because remember, it's taken massive amounts of QE since we were already at the zero lower bound. The Fed, remember, only had room to cut 2%. That's 200 basis points, down from 2% to 0. Or maybe maybe it was at 2.25, and they were able to cut all the way, cut 225 basis points. Still, that's nothing. And so this whole, the past 4 years have been funded and inflated by QE. And so QT, that's a big part of the story here. It's arguably bigger than the rate hikes, although the rate hikes are on top of the QE. And so perhaps they're more significant because rate cuts were not enough to get us to this point. And so any rate hike should be viewed as potentially catastrophic. We don't know which one will be it, but we can guess it's somewhere around 1%. Currently, we're at 25 basis points, 0.25%. If the Fed hikes 50 basis points at each meeting coming up, or even if they just do it at the once, one 50 basis point rate hike will get us to 0.75%, 0.75%. The next 50 basis point rate hike will get us to 1.25. So that'll be over half of the peak of the Fed funds rate way back in 2018, 2019. And then we've got $95 billion in QT every month on top of that. We are standing at the precipice. This isn't hard to figure out. I mean, correlation. I'm not one of these correlation equals causation people. But it's a pretty unmistakable chart. You plot net QE against the growth of the stock market. It becomes pretty obvious what negative net QE, i.e. quantitative tightening, what that will do to stocks and therefore the price of all assets. And as we know, after 2008, the Fed has been since 2008, the Fed has relied on the wealth effect to try to inflate the GDP of the United States. But now that we're in an inflationary environment, the Fed, in their basic Keynesian logic, is you want to inflate the economy until you have an inflation problem, and then you want to deflate the economy until you have a deflation problem. That's basic hydraulic Keynesianism, which is still practiced widely at the Fed. I mean, they still use the Phillips curve. I mean, think about it. These people are dinosaurs. So the strategy is clear. The question is how long before the Fed chickens out and they renege. Because that's what makes it very hard to plan, is that this Fed, the Powell Fed, is unreliable. At least I should say they're unreliable when they claim to be hawks, when they're trying to act hawkish. Powell's never as hawkish as he claims. So if you try to plan for a hawkish Fed, you're going to be the one who gets screwed. Even though the solution's staring us in the face, we need to kill asset prices. We need to kill the stock market, the bond market, the real estate market. That way, if people's assets, their net worth is sapped, they will begin saving money. They will not spend as much of their income every week. They will start putting money away in the bank. That's the idea. And voila, you've got this a big reduction in consumer spending, which will reduce inflation because you're reducing the demand side of the consumer economy. And so therefore producers will be able to catch back up with demand, and things will be better. And I agree, this is what the Fed should do. But I don't think that Powell really wants, even though he knows that the answer is to kill the stock market, I don't think he has it in him. Because in the class that Powell's from, everybody at his country club, even he himself, these are asset-owning people. And inflation, it's not affecting them that much. They are so wealthy relative to their cost of living. They're able to get by. If their cost of living goes up, so much percentage every year, it's not an issue. But if the price of their assets goes down 30% in 1 year, that's a real big issue for them. And so the social pressure on Powell, if you think about the bubble that he lives in, again, and his own personal self-interest, considering he is a very wealthy man, doing what's right in America means doing what's wrong for Jerome Powell and all of his friends and everyone he's ever known. And then, of course, the Fed also has the federal government to worry about. The Fed cannot think of itself as responsible for driving the federal government into bankruptcy. Obviously, that would be the end of America. By that, I mean the end of the American government, not the end of the American, country. All the land and all the people still be here. But the regime in Washington would go belly up if their interest rates rose. But as of right now, even though, Fed funds is rising, it's not like we're seeing Treasury Yields spike, because Treasury Yields are seen as a safe haven in times like this when asset prices overall, are seen as being in decline. People will buy treasuries. Speaking of the treasury market, I think I mentioned that the 2s and the 10s inverted last week, I think it was, or maybe the week before. That's always, it's supposed to be a signal of a coming recession time. And I don't know if I mentioned this in the video, but I was thinking in my head certainly at the time, but who knows how long it'll be until it uninverts, and when the yield curve uninverts, i.e., steepens, goes back to looking a little more normal. That's actually the signal that the recession is imminent. And here we have a situation where the 2s and the 10s inverted for a pretty short period of time and has now steepened again. And so that would seem to imply that the recession is perhaps much closer than people anticipate. And honestly, if that's indeed the case, I think I'll become much more optimistic, because this is something that I've been waiting for many years. I've been waiting for the asset bubble to crash. I don't have time to get into all the details as to why, but I think that this asset bubble is at the core of a lot of the problems with our society. It's obviously a symptom of our very unhealthy economy. But it's more than just the economy. It's not just, how easy it is to, find a good job or whatever and buy a home. It's also about, how that affects families, how that affects individual people who are trying to, plan for their future. These asset bubbles are good for exactly one group of people who already own the assets, which are going up. If you don't own assets, you might say, oh, well, gee, I should buy assets, and then, it'll go up and up and up, and then I can be one of these rich people too. And, when you look at more objective valuations and you realize, hey, these assets are in a bubble, they're way overpriced. Do I really want to get into the market now, because it could collapse at any moment, because there's nothing but hot air under the current price? And so if you took that more cautious, perhaps more responsible stance, you've been one of the people who have suffered the most in recent years. Now, of course, for people at the very bottom of the rung, that was never an option to begin with, because you don't have enough income in order to invest even a little bit of money into assets. And it's for the people at the bottom that whatever inflation does occur, even if it might be considered small, a small price to pay for blowing this big asset bubble. Let's say cost of living goes up 3% a year, but stock market goes up 10% a year. The wizards of smart would consider that to be a very lucrative trade. But if you're someone who can't afford stocks to begin with, your cost of living just goes up 3% every year. Your salary or your wages might not go up at all. So therefore, you keep getting poorer and poorer, and those who even might not be rich, but are somewhat well off, are able to become rich, and those who are already rich become much richer. And are they doing so, because of merit, because they made good decisions, because they added value to the economy, and so people chose to give them their money, and that's how they got rich? Did they invent something really useful for their fellow man? No, they just bought stunks, and stunks always go up. And that's the world that Jerome Powell is scared to death of losing. It's a world that he's been clinging to for his entire time as Fed chairman. And he just started his second term. So, I don't know. I lean towards no. I lean towards not buying that he could hold out. But if that's the case, then, we have no hope of really reigning in this depression. Reigning in this inflation. At the end of the day, when you have more consumers than producers, when you have more consumption than production, that's not a magic fairy tale land. You can't get anything for free. You're just going to end up with inflation. So in order to end this cycle, the stock market must be brought to its knees. But if that happens, I think that there's a strong chance that the political system in the United States breaks down entirely. We're a financialized society, and we have a financial oligarchy who controls a highly financialized government. The very existence of the United States is tied directly into the health of the global financial markets. And global financial markets, of course, flow through New York City. And you know what? Before I even get into that, maybe I'll skip it entirely for time's sake. Whatever inflation is reduced by reversing the wealth effect, something that Bill Dudley, the former New York Fed president, talked about in a recent interview. You know what? I think there was an article that linked to it on. It was a tweet. A Zero Hedge article brought it up. I think I might link to that in the description. But I talked earlier about the wealth effect. Drive asset prices up, drive up consumption. Dudley was talking about, obviously, you can do the same in reverse. If you have an inflation problem, reduce asset prices, reduce consumption, and therefore reduce inflation. But in doing so, obviously, this means a Great Depression. The federal government, on a bipartisan basis, will act to intervene to try and quote-unquote stimulate the economy, i.e. do the exact opposite of what the Fed is doing. Undo, if the Fed actually has the balls to do this, undo what the Fed is doing and replace the consumption that was lost by the reverse wealth effect with government spending. And they will pay for this with debt monetized by the Fed, which will, it's just the Fed doing the same thing. And if the Fed is really serious about this, the Fed would have to say to the federal government, we're not going to monetize your debt. But that's another red line that I just don't think that Powell will ever cross. I think that Powell will ensure that the federal government is able to write whatever checks it feels that it needs to write. You know what it comes down to is that living standards in America are in a bubble. They've been in a bubble since the 1980s. We never really recovered after the 70s. The malaise, that was attributed to, Jimmy Carter being president, that was supposedly eschewed by Ronald Reagan, none of that went away. We replaced the lost consumption that came from the decline in the U.S. economy, the decline in U.S. industrial output, the decline in um, in manufacturing and mining and all these things in the production of goods. We replaced that with trade deficits, starting under Ronald Reagan. So what that means is that every year, the United States as a whole consumes more than it produces. And if anyone remembers Say's law, that's something that you can't do. Or more specifically, production precedes consumption. You can't consume something before producing it. And so the way that we have been able to consume so much more than we produce every year is by effectively stealing it from the rest of the world by exporting our own inflation. That has kept Americans fat and happy and somewhat tolerant of one another. People are still at each other's throats, but they don't want to give up what we have because we live really darn well here, considering our circumstances. And that's why I can't see either both the federal government and the Fed allowing the necessary recession to occur, because we're at the end of that bubble. I don't think at this point, once inflation started, that was the Achilles heel of this whole system, because it has no way of fighting inflation. The only way to fight inflation is by destroying the current economic and financial system. And so even if the Fed says, okay, we'll hold our nose and crash the stock market, the federal government will have to come in and quote unquote stimulate the economy, to save us from the next Great Depression. Whereas the Depression itself is the cure to all of this financial and social toxicity that is built up over these many decades. But if both were to do so, if we got that depression, if all of the inflation that was lost through the reverse wealth effect was not supplanted by federal government stimulus, we would see a breakdown in social cohesion. America is a nation of consumers united in what we consider to be prosperity. It is a kind of prosperity because we're not poor. And I mean that on a relative basis. Someone, of my economic standing in, let's say, a place like South Africa or India would have a much lower standard of living than I do in the United States. That's what we Americans have in common. We have a relatively low baseline of social cohesion. There's a lot of diversity, real diversity in America. I'm not talking about skin color. I mean, people are different, culturally different, different values. And because we are more prosperous than we otherwise would be, we're less concerned with those differences than we otherwise would be. Karl Marx said that religion was the opiate of the masses, but in post-Cold War America, really post-1980 America, consumption is the opiate of the masses. Even in this time of relative scarcity, I can go on Amazon or walk into a Walmart and buy almost anything I could ever think of, anything I could ever want. And it's at the most, 24 to 48 hours away from me. And it's not even expensive. It's cheap. Maybe not as cheap as it was a year or two ago, but compared to what it should cost, compared to what it would have cost me in the 1960s, it's cheap. But once that goes away, once people don't have everything that they want at their fingertips, once people have to work hard to try and get basic things in life, which a lot of people already have to, granted. But think of just turning up the heat, 10 degrees, let's say, in the kitchen. It's not like you weren't, under stress trying to get dinner ready before that. But if you turn up the heat 10 degrees, you're that much more uncomfortable. And so that's when people start to focus on what they don't like about each other. That's when they start to blame one another. Because no matter how high your standards of living, let's say that our standards of living don't get that bad in the wake of the next depression, they'll definitely be lower. And people will be angry about that, because once you lose something that you've become accustomed to, It's not a comfortable feeling. Nobody likes to get poorer. People want to get richer. If they get richer or stay the same, they're pretty good. They're okay. But if they're getting poorer, that doesn't feel right. It goes against, sort of the human desire for progress in life. Decline is something that people have feared for centuries, for probably millennia. The concept of decline, the decline of anything, the decline, in their own health as they age, the decline, in empires, obviously, Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, very, well-known book, but it's not just about empires, it's about everything. And so, if the current system were to collapse, do you think that people would want to go back to it? Do you think that they would want to recreate it in the same way that they did? You look at a country like France. If France were to collapse tomorrow, it might have a new regime. They might have a sixth republic or a third empire or, whatever you want to call it. But at the end of the day, it'll still be France. But if the system were to collapse here in America, do you think there would still be a recognizable America on the map? Do you think that California would still associate with the people in Alabama? What we have here in America has been decaying for a long time, and people have tried to paper over that decline with these asset bubbles. Rather than addressing the structural problems with the American economy, which were leading to structural problems with American society, look at the correlation between opioid addiction and the Rust Belt towns that have been hollowed out over the past 40 years. It's not that hard to figure out. The difference between an empire and a nation is that when a nation collapses, the nation comes back together and reforms and rebuilds itself. But an empire that is not made up of a nation, that has no true nation, undergirding it, when the superstructure collapses, people don't come back together and rebuild something similar in its place. They build new structures. That's a true implication of what the Fed is considering. And it's why I'm so skeptical. I don't think that the system is ready to give up on itself. But nevertheless, you need to prepare for the consequences. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.